First of all, a huge thanks to Royal Museums Greenwich, which includes the National Maritime Museum, the Cutty Sark, and in this particular video's case, the Royal Observatory, for their cooperation and help when it came to filming this video. In particular case for this video, allowing me access to the Royal Observatory and permission to film the wonderful clocks which you're going to see later on in this video, which are still working, by the way. If you do find yourself in London, you can of course visit the Royal Observatory yourself to find out more about the subject of this particular video, and you can of course also visit the National Maritime Museum and the Cutty Sark and Queen's House for various other eras of naval history. Now, on with the video. On the 22nd of October 1707, a British fleet under the command of Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel was returning to Portsmouth after a campaign undertaken as part of the War of the Spanish Succession. His force consisted of 21 vessels, 2 small unrated ships, 4 fire ships, and 15 ships of the line, the latter including multiple 3-deck first and second rates, and so representing a significant portion of the Royal Navy's heavy battle line firepower for the period. Cloudesley Shovel had a well-deserved reputation for success in battle by this point, and was of the rank equivalent to what today would be termed Admiral of the Fleet, and the crews of the ships were mostly made up of experienced sailors who were now entering home waters. To be fair, the journey back hadn't been easy. Gales, squalls, and general overcast weather had impaired their ability to take most of their standard navigational observations, particularly that of latitude, which could only be observed a handful of times during the voyage. Soundings were still possible, and the previous day the soundings had indicated that they were leaving the deep ocean and entering the approaches to land. A fortunate break in the weather meant that a latitude reading taken at the same time had given them a value of almost but not quite 49 degrees north. Consulting their charts, this suggested they were about 200 miles west-southwest of the Scilly Isles, the southwesternmost outpost of the British Isles, since this was where these two data points appeared to coincide. The wind now shifted in their favour, and the ship set sail roughly east by northeast, heading for home, relying on dead reckoning as the shifting winds and currents carried them in what they hoped was roughly the right direction. Then, at about 8 PM on the 22nd, there was a sudden crash of timber on rock as the fleet ran headlong into the rocks of the Scilly Isles. The flagship HMS Association had her hull ripped open, and the mighty 90-gun 3-decker vanished beneath the waves in less than 5 minutes, taking every single one of the over 800 men aboard with her, including Admiral Shovel. Behind her came the first-rate HMS St George, which saw the flagship go down and heeled rapidly to try and avoid a similar fate. It wasn't quite fast enough to escape scot-free. The ship still struck rocks and stuck fast to them, but it was a glancing blow, and the reduced speed of it meant that the ship was eventually able to get off the rocks and limp home. The fire ship Phoenix had the same experience, but as a much smaller ship it went on to beach itself so that repairs could be made before it also eventually made it home. The 70-gun third-rate HMS Eagle was not so lucky. Like the Association, she went down almost immediately with a similar number of people on board, again with no survivors. The fourth-rate HMS Romney also heeled over and vanished almost in the blink of an eye. 289 men were lost with her, with only her quartermaster somehow surviving. Lastly, the fireship HMS Firebrand smashed into the same rock that minutes earlier had claimed the Association. The smaller ship was then lifted back out to sea by a large wave and desperately steered for land, but she foundered before getting there, with 28 out of her 40 crew going down with her. The first-rate HMS Royal Anne was spared from a similar fate by the narrowest of margins, the crew having just enough time to set the sails and her tiller enough to avoid the foaming seas around the rocks, although it was so close that as she heeled into the turn, the sailors who were risking their lives out on the yards to manage the topsails could look straight down onto the outcrops that oh so nearly claimed their lives. Somewhere between 1,400 and 2,000 men were lost in the space of a few minutes that night, making it one of the worst disasters in the history of the Royal Navy. There were a variety of factors involved in that night's events, including a current that some sailors suspected but was not actually confirmed to exist until the 19th century, which had contributed to dragging the fleet well north of where they thought they were. But one of the factors was a lack of an ability to calculate longitude. In response to this, and a number of other disasters, a presentation was made to Parliament a few years later on this exact problem, and in 1714, the Longitude Act was passed. This offered a series of prizes: £10,000 to the person who could find a reliable way of determining longitude at sea with an error of plus or minus a degree, or 60 nautical miles at most, since the distance described by a degree of longitude varies depending on how close you are to the poles or the equator. If the error was plus or minus 40 minutes of a degree, or 2/3 of a degree, or 40 nautical miles, the prize was £15,000, and if the error was plus or minus half a degree, or within 30 nautical miles of where the destination actually was, the prize would be £20,000. A number of lesser prizes were also offered for methods that might work only close to the coastline, which was where most of the ship losses occurred, or if somebody had a recognisably good idea but might lack the funds to actually properly implement it. To give some idea of the value, adjusting purely for inflation, the top prize was worth about £3.2 million. But in terms of relative value, i.e. what that money could do for you in society as a whole, such as buying houses and that kind of thing, it was actually worth closer to £56 million. Or, to put it in a more proximate context, this was about the cost of a large fifth-rate or a small fourth-rate warship outright. But why was determining longitude so important? Well, working out where you are at sea without modern luxuries like GPS is a surprisingly difficult process. You might think that if you know what direction you're going, i.e. you've got a decent compass, itself not necessarily a guaranteed thing for most of recorded history, and you know what speed you're travelling at, you can simply chart your route on a map, assuming that the map is accurate, and you know where you started. This is the most basic form of dead reckoning. But with wind, waves, currents, and a number of other factors all conspiring to push your ship to a position other than that which simple dead reckoning might suggest, you would very quickly end up thinking you were in one place, but actually in a completely different location. And that location could often be upside down, drowning, or on fire, having just smashed into some immovable object like a large rock. And that's if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, you might find yourself wandering the oceans for weeks or months as your supplies gradually run out, and it becomes a race between dehydration, starvation, and scurvy to see what gets you first. So, how did sailors up to this point succeed in, usually at least, not dying? Luck played a part, but there were also a number of methods you could use to increase your chances. If you sailed a mostly coastal route conducting local trade, or international trade, but with a relatively small open ocean crossing, like, say, the Dover Straits, the Bosporus, the Straits of Gibraltar, the area between Sicily, Italy, Malta, and North Africa, and other such areas, then you could generally build up a working knowledge of the winds, tides, currents, and landscape features along your route, and then use these to give yourself the best launching point into the open water passages, which then should be short enough that you'd end up in roughly the right area on the other end via simple dead reckoning. This local knowledge is still valued for coastal trade and in such professions as harbour pilots, even today in the age of digital navigation. But if you wanted to go on longer open water journeys, or you wanted to go on multiple different trade routes where finding enough people with the relevant knowledge would be impractical and or impractically expensive, it was, by this stage, at the beginning of the 18th century, known that there were two things that could tell you where you were: latitude and longitude. Latitude is where you are north or south of the equator, and that can be relatively easily worked out to a decent degree of accuracy by measuring the height, and therefore the angle, of the sun at noon, accounting for the variance of the seasons where necessary. This was relatively easy to do with a variety of instruments, everything down to just a vertical stick, as long as you could see the sun. or there was enough glare. And with some equipment, even a relatively cloudy day could at least give you a passable measure. But this only gave you a horizontal line going around the world that you were somewhere on. Longitude is where you are east or west relative to a given meridian or zero line. If you knew this, then where the latitude and longitude lines intersected was your precise location. Exactly which meridian you used didn't matter too much, as long as your charts and other calculation books reflected that particular choice. Some meridians ran through a given nation's capital. Others ran through various other places for political reasons, like the one that was drawn through the Canary Islands. Others were drawn for religious reasons. Meridians existed through Rome and Jerusalem, for example. Still others were based on some theory of a natural global meridian that could be found by empirical experimentation, and others simply because it made drawing the map of a given area rather easy, either by running centrally down the area depicted, or being placed to the extreme left like the 0 point of a graph, depending on the mapmaker's preference. Of course, this plethora of meridians and the expanding nature of global trade could make getting all your charts referencing the same meridian a little bit difficult. On land, though, working out longitude was fairly easy. It was already known that at different longitudes the sun reached noon at different times relative to your given meridian, and since both the units of time and those of longitude and latitude worked on a base 60 numerical system, they divide into each other rather neatly. So if you had a clock that was set to the time that was apparent at your meridian point, and another which was set to your local noon, you could determine the difference between them, and then calculate how many degrees, minutes, and seconds of longitude you were east or west of your central location. There were other methods, such as observing eclipses, that also worked for fixed points on land, but eclipses happened hopelessly far apart to be of any real use on a sea voyage. The problem thus was not in determining whether longitude could be calculated at all, it was just that these methods didn't work at sea. For example, with a clock-based method, the temperature aboard a ship could not be kept steady in all weathers, and this meant that the materials used in many clocks would either expand or contract. This could then lead to the delicate mechanisms either skipping, losing time, or the tension being increased, making them run fast, assuming that your clock actually ran to time in the first place. On land, this could be corrected periodically by referencing local noon or various other fixed observations, and the known differences between fixed points. At sea, you were always moving, and working out when local noon happened to be the entire point. Another factor was the way the clocks of the time were powered. Ships, of course, moved in 3 dimensions at sea, sometimes more violently than others, and the delicate systems of balances, weights, pendulums, springs, and other tensioning methods were affected by these as well. So, even if you had a clock that was immune to changes in temperature or humidity, and that normally would run perfectly true, being on a ship could still throw out its measurements. So for longer trips, say across the North Sea, or for the various transatlantic and even trans-Pacific voyages that were relatively common by the early 18th century, the use of latitude-only methods had to suffice. This would be supplemented, where possible, as Shovel's fleet had tried to do, with observations of known points that had already been surveyed, like the rise in the seabed via soundings. Assuming that these had all been charted and provided known points, and that they'd been charted accurately in the first place, but if they had, once you knew where these fixed points were, you could locate them in conjunction with the latitude when you passed them on a map. The problem was that even if all of this came to pass, you had to know you were in that approximate area to be able to make that observation. And even then, it only told you that you were at a particular known fixed geographic place. Before or after you ran into that fixed point, you were still very much in the dark, and if you didn't know you were in the area of that fixed point in the first place, interpreting what an observation might mean, such as a sounding where the seabed was rising, might be almost impossible, because that could happen in a lot of places. But, at its crudest, a latitude-only method could rely on simply sailing out from your starting location for a time, just enough to clear any land that you might run into in the direction that you're about to go, Then head north or south as applicable until you reached the latitude of your destination. Then sail east or west as needed, staying on that line until you reach your destination. Or for more complex routes, you might reach a reference point like an island where you could make another adjustment. In theory, you could do this anywhere along your route, but it was held to be better to make any changes early when your dead reckoning might still be somewhat accurate, as simply heading east or west and hoping to make the change at the last possible minute might leave you running straight into the coast if your guess as to the distance travelled was actually less than reality was, or it might leave you to navigate a very unfamiliar coastline. But this method was inefficient, since it essentially made safe travel into a series of vertical and horizontal movements, which might not cooperate with the wind, and in any case was longer than a more direct route. It was also unreliable, since any long-term navigation could mean that you would end up on your chosen latitude, but exactly where on it relative to your destination could be completely unknown, which might leave you going in entirely the wrong direction with very limited supplies. Indeed, in 1741, decades after the Longitude Act, but before the solution had been finally worked out, Commodore Anson, in his famous round-the-world journey aboard HMS Centurion, faced exactly this problem. He was trying to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific around the tip of South America. He'd sailed west, having reached a latitude of 60 degrees south, straight into the face of a terrible storm. Dead reckoning, after quite a while of sailing, told him that he was finally through the straits, and so he headed north to the 35 degrees south latitude, which should then allow him to reach Juan Fernandez Island, where there was food, fresh water, and timber, all of which his battered ship and dying crew desperately needed. But the storms had meant that the vessel had actually sailed far less to the west than they had thought, and without any way of working out their actual longitude, the ship ran almost directly into Tierra del Fuego's west coast instead. So he headed west a bit more, and then north, finally reaching 35 degrees south in reality. Now he was at the right latitude, but again, without any longitude position, he had no idea if he should run east or west to find the island. Initially, he went west, but after 4 days he concluded that he must have sailed too far west when they were further south, and so he had to double back. In fact, he was actually hours away from his destination, and so after sailing back east again, and almost running straight into Spanish-controlled Chile, they had to double back yet again, over 2 weeks since they'd first reached the correct latitude. This delay was costing him 80 men to scurvy just during this east-west search, and still more would die once they reached the island as they were too far gone to recover. This incident, as well as the storm, would leave him with less than half the 500-strong original crew of the Centurion. The tragedy was doubly terrible because 5 years earlier, in 1736, a relatively unknown clockmaker who called himself George Harrison had boarded the ship and used a clock that he had devised to try and win the Longitude Act prize, to successfully help navigate the Centurion from Britain to Lisbon in Portugal. Although the clock still had some issues with losing time on the voyage, the return trip aboard HMS Orford had showed its value, as the clock had indicated their longitude was about 60 miles different to that which the ship's officers had calculated. This turned out to be very fortunate, as the approach the ship was making was eerily similar to the one that Admiral Shovel's fleet had made several decades before, and the clock saved Orford from likewise going aground on the southwest tip of the British Isles. But that particular device, Clock H1 as we call it these days, which we'll come to later, still had lost some time, as we'd noted earlier, and thus was felt unsuitable for long-distance voyages. Now, to be clear, the 1714 Longitude Act was far from the first time governments had tried to offer insane rewards for solving this problem. The ability to calculate longitude aboard ships would mean shorter trade routes, fewer wrecks, and a more accurate and more mobile navy. In short, it could be a game-changer that could completely upset the balance of power. Philip II of Spain, he of the Armada, had offered just such a prize, and his successor Philip III had renewed this offer with a prize that was worth 60 times the average annual income, which would then be given to the winner as a permanent pension, i.e. you'd get that money once a year, every year, plus another sum that was worth 180 times the average annual income as a lump sum to start with. The Dutch got in on this act in the 1600s as their own international trade took off, and dozens of inventions were offered up. Some were obviously impractical, but quite a number were well thought out enough that the respective governments paid the inventors' expenses, even if the mechanisms themselves didn't actually pan out. Britain and France also offered such prizes at various levels, mostly privately, but these came in the latter part of the 1600s as their own trade empires finally began to take off. With the Longitude Act, however, came not just the prize, but a specified method of testing. Specifically, any entry would be held to be a success when, according to the Act, a ship by the appointment of the said commissioners, or the major part of them, shall thereby actually sail over the ocean from Great Britain to any such port in the West Indies as those commissioners, or the major part of them, shall choose or nominate for the experiment, without losing their longitude beyond the limits before mentioned. The commissioners being those of the Board of Longitude, which was now established to make judgments on the various entries. Although coming from a wide range of backgrounds, the majority of members of the board fell into one of three categories: MPs, professors of mathematics from Oxford and Cambridge, or admirals of the Royal Navy. The Astronomer Royal was thrown in there for good measure. Isaac Newton summarised the state of scientific progress at the time, and the methods that were being proposed as front-runners. As he was president of the Royal Society of the time, he was well placed to understand these things. The methods being, as per his entry, 1 is by a watch to keep time exactly, but by reason of the motion of a ship, the variation of heat and cold, and the difference of gravity in different latitudes, such a watch hath not yet been made. Another is by the eclipses of Jupiter's satellites, but by reason of the length of telescopes requisite to observe them and the motion of a ship at sea, those eclipses cannot yet there be observed. A third is by the place of the moon, but her theory is not yet exact enough for this purpose. It is exact enough to determine her longitude within 2 or 3 degrees, but not within a degree. A fourth is Mr. Ditton's project, but this is rather for keeping an account of the longitude at sea than for finding it if at any time it should be lost, as it may easily be in cloudy weather. This latter scheme was, as noted, not one for calculation, but rather one of reference. Very briefly, the idea was actually quite hilarious at first glance. It supposed that old ships could be taken out to sea as hulks and anchored at fixed points of longitude in lines across the ocean, presumably using an eclipse fix or similar to work out where they were to start with. Quite how you anchored an old galleon in several miles of ocean was never quite fully explained, but supposing that you could do this, these ships would then be well provisioned and have a small crew who would be resupplied and or relieved by maintenance vessels that would run up and down the latitude lines that these lines of ships would follow. The main point of these hulks was that each one would be stocked with an arsenal of enormous firework rockets. These would then be launched at set times at night, with each somehow contriving to reach an altitude of over 6,000 feet, which for reference is about double the current world record for a fireworks altitude, at least officially, whereupon this late Stuart-early Georgian era short-range ballistic missile would detonate in appropriately apocalyptic style, allowing any and all ships over a very wide radius to mark the location and bearing of the detonation, and hence, by its colour and time, determine their own distance from the hulk in question, and thus their own relative longitude. Quite who was going to pay for a significant portion of the planet's collective firepower as of 1714 to be deployed at sea and then blasted into the sky at regular intervals was never entirely clear either, and needless to say, this project didn't really go anywhere. Another option that wasn't listed was the use of the Earth's magnetic field, the theory at the time going that patterns therein might be regular enough to be mapped, and if so, then a ship's compass and the deflection within it might be able to be used. This would eventually run into the problems that the Earth's magnetic field was both far from regular and also changed almost constantly, albeit it would take some time before everybody actually realised this. Both of these methods relied on working out your location relative to a fixed point, either the ballistic missile galleon or a magnetic variance that had been mapped out earlier. The other three were more along the lines of what everybody was actually looking for, a method of working out exactly where you were at any time of day or night without reference to external reference points at sea. The Jupiter option relied on the eclipses of the then known moons of Jupiter, which were a lot more frequent than eclipses of Earth's own moon, being used as a giant celestial clock in the sky. Since these eclipses would occur at a known time, it would be possible to use these observations against an almanac in a number of ways, for example in reference to local noon to determine the local time and hence the longitude. The issue here was, as Newton noted, only a few telescopes in the world actually had the fidelity to make such observations, and even if these were somehow produced in mass numbers and the mariners trained to use them, at least on larger vessels, quite how you'd keep your telescope focused on an absolutely tiny point in the sky that was the Jovian system whilst you were on a pitching and rolling ship was another matter entirely. In his last years, not less a person than Galileo himself had tried to perfect a stabilised telescope helmet to assist with this endeavour. Other ideas called for the astronomer and his telescope to be enclosed in a spherical chamber that was half full of oil, from which he would then make his navigational predictions, as the oil would in theory remain stable from all of the ship's motions, bar of course the vertical. This somewhat Italian version of an early Warhammer 40k astropath aside, many others had since attempted to square the circle of seaborne observations, whilst the same techniques applied on land were actually in the process of greatly improving the mapping of European coastlines, since of course the land usually tends to stay in one place. The lunar method was again an old one. This was a little bit easier to observe than Jupiter's moons, the moon is somewhat larger in the sky, and was similarly based on the idea of having an almanac. In this case, the idea was to use a cross-staff, at the very basic level, to observe the moon's location and the angles between it and certain key stars. Between this and the relative altitude of those stars in the sky, it should be possible to determine exactly which set of alignments were being observed, and thus the predicted time that they occurred at, compared to the local noon, would give you your longitude. Unfortunately, again, as Newton observed, the calculations, tables and instruments that were available at the time were not yet refined enough to give anything of particular value. 2 or 3 degrees of error was, at the largest value, almost the entire distance between Admiral Shovel's last fixed location and his encounter with the Scilly Isles almost a day later.
One side effect of attempts to solve the problem via these methods, though, would turn out to be quite useful later on. The need for more accurate observations to help with more accurate predictions led in the 1670s to the setup of an observatory here on Crooms Hill in Greenwich, which you can see behind me. This would then become the Royal Observatory very soon thereafter, and in 1721 it was decided to establish a new meridian which passed through this observatory. Over time, this became more and more important for reasons we'll explain later on, but it would eventually become the Greenwich Prime Meridian, from which we derive Greenwich Mean Time, and if you happen to be in space, Universal Time. And we're going to go and have a look inside in a little bit to see what other things we can find in the observatory that relate to the problem of longitude.
This leaves us with the final method, or the first one in Newton's list, a clock. In order to meet the standards of the Longitude Act, such a clock could not gain or lose more than 3 seconds in every 24-hour period, since each of these errors would in theory be cumulative, and on the typical month and a third voyage across the Atlantic, the maximum accumulation of these errors would reach about 2 minutes, which might not seem like a lot, but it would be enough to throw the longitude calculations out to the very limits of the degree variance that the minimum acceptable entry would have. Anything that gained or lost more than 3 seconds a day was not admissible. This posed a problem, since at the time of the Act's passing, A clock had been invented that was suspended in a vacuum, thus keeping out changes in pressure or humidity, mounted on gimbals to minimise impacts from a ship's motion, and set with 2 separate driving springs so as to never lose time whilst being wound. And even this had an error of up to 6 seconds a day, partially because none of these measures dealt with the changes in temperature, which affected the materials that it was made of, and partly because even the gimbals didn't entirely shield the balances and the escapement from the inertial effects of a ship at sea.
Now, as we enter the Greenwich Observatory itself, we also enter the hero of this story into our account. George Harrison, born in 1693 in Yorkshire, grew up as a carpenter with an interest in music. In 1713, aged 20, he built his first clock, powered by a pendulum. With no training in the clock or watchmaker's arts, and having learned all he knew of the dark art of chronomancy from a copy of Newton's Principia and a series of lectures by the mathematician Nicholas Saunderson, who taught at Cambridge and had his talks transcribed into a book, he'd built his first clock almost entirely of wood. The presence of metal was minimal. Even the gears were wooden, cut from oak, working with the grain to prevent wear or snapping. He also included a handy reference to reconcile the strictly mechanical advance of time on his clocks with the slight variance that you'd encounter using sundials or other popular methods of telling the time that were prevalent in the 1710s.
At some point, he must have heard of the Longitude Prize, but kept going with his own wooden clocks for some time thereafter, proving to be something of a horological prodigy. In 1722, he completed another clock, almost entirely made of wood, and this was made for Brocklesby Park for installation in its clock tower. Using minimal amounts of brass, the majority of the moving parts that in almost all other clocks of metal are in this case carved from lignum vitae, which means that the clock needs no greasing and has, as of this year, kept near perfect time for over 300 years without stopping, except for once in 1884 where they had to forcibly stop it so that the tower could be refurbished. Yeah, the tower was falling apart before the clock did. Part of Harrison's ingenuity showed forth in a series of clocks that he built in the 1720s, inventing and including a gridiron pendulum, which utilised a series of plates of brass and steel about halfway along the pendulum arm, which eliminated at a stroke the perennial problem that such clocks had experienced in the past with temperature-controlled expansion, making them gain or lose time as heat or cold swept over them. His new clocks had a gain or loss time of less than a second per month, helped by another invention he'd devised, the grasshopper escapement, which allowed the clock gears to advance at a fixed rate rather reliably. Then, in 1727, Harrison decided that he had learned enough to tackle the problem of seagoing clocks, although this would mean immediately abandoning his advances in long pendulum design, as he instantly recognised that this was never going to work aboard a heaving ship, and so he began to sketch out a plan for a sea-going clock to solve the problem of longitude. In early 1730, he was finally happy with a draft design and set out south for London. When he arrived in the summer, he was not the first to have tried to build a clock to solve the issue. As Newton had observed 16 years earlier, this particular solution was well known in principle. It was making the clock itself that was the issue, and many attempts had reached varying levels of success, but never quite made themselves accurate enough over long service at sea. Since the Board of Longitude was made up of many important men with full-time jobs, there was no building or desk that he could just approach for a hearing. The board would only convene when enough members had been convinced to summon all the others to have a look at the latest proposal, a situation that had thus far failed to transpire beyond the interest of a handful of vaguely bemused boardmen showing up before somebody inevitably spotted a major flaw or other in the latest presentation. However, Harrison knew Edmund Halley, the famous astronomer and discoverer of Halley's Comet, and he was a member of the board, and more importantly, Harrison knew where to find Halley, here at the Greenwich Observatory. However, whilst Halley himself could see the promise in the plans, the older man also knew many on the board were quite focused on the heavens to solve the problem, and no amount of pretty diagrams were likely to persuade them otherwise. Instead, he directed Harrison, with some encouragement, to go and seek out George Graham, an expert watchmaker, deviser of scientific instruments, and Fellow of the Royal Society. Arriving at Graham's residence at 10 o'clock in the morning, Harrison left 10 hours later with a significant loan with which he was told to construct his proposed timepiece.
And so began 5 long years of work. Along with his brother James, this would eventually result in George Harrison building his first so-called C clock, which we now call H1, Harrison 1, very original I know. Here it is. In 1735, this very 38-kilo timepiece stood on a desk in George Graham's office in London, having already experienced a maiden voyage on a barge on the River Humber up north before it was brought south to London. Looking more like an escapee from a Doctor Who set rather than a clock, it uses wooden lignum vitae bearings to escape the need for oil and grease, along with his grasshopper escapement and a short pendulum on a spring with bar balance weights, which you can see pinging around in the background. These set against the motion of each other so that some movement of a ship that throws one off will be counterbalanced by the other. Various other balance springs built in, you can see it down there at the bottom, secure various other parts of the device. The Royal Society came to see it after a note arrived from member George Graham, which stated, "John Harrison, having with great labour and expense contrived and executed a machine for measuring time at sea, upon such principle as seems to us to promise a very great and sufficient degree of exactness, we are of opinion it highly deserves public encouragement, in order to execute a thorough trial and improvement of these several contrivances for preventing those irregularities in time that naturally arise from the different degrees of heat and cold, and moist and dry temperatures of the air, and various agitations of the ship." It would be this exact clock which in 1736 would be found aboard HMS Centurion heading for Lisbon, accompanied by Harrison and a note from the First Lord of the Admiralty to the ship's captain. The note stated, "Sir, the instrument which is put on board your ship has been approved by all the mathematicians in town that have seen it, and a few have not, to be the best that has been made for measuring time. How it will succeed at sea, you will be a judge. I have writ to Sir John Norris to desire him to send home the instrument and the maker of it, who I think you have with you, by the first ship that comes. The man is said by those who know him best to be a very ingenious and sober man, and capable of finding out something more than he has already, if he can find encouragement. I desire, therefore, that you will let the man be used civilly, and that you will be as kind to him as you can." To be honest, he was probably just glad that the Admiralty hadn't sent him to sea with any of those gigantic fireworks, more than anything else, so Captain Proctor duly set sail, and, as recounted earlier, Harrison and this clock made their way back home aboard the Orford, which he saved before heading back to London for the first full meeting of the Board of Longitude. Hilariously, the only person present with any significant criticism of the clock was Harrison himself. In between bouts of horrific seasickness, thanks to the heavy weather aboard the Centurion on its way south, he'd been at work rectifying a few minor issues that had caused it to lose time along the way, which was in part why the device performed so much better on the way back. Its deviation was actually within the parameters to be eligible for the £10,000 prize. But he told the board there were some issues he wanted to correct, as well as trying to make the whole thing smaller. If it pleased the board and they would advance him a sum for another 2 years of work, he could return with another, even better timepiece, which he would be happy to send on the official test voyage to the West Indies. With £250 paid immediately and another £250 available upon completion, the board would impose one last condition. Once the work was finished, both of the timepieces would belong to them. Harrison agreed, moved to London, and began work in 1737 on his next project, the clock that would become known as H2. And here is H2. Believe it or not, it is a bit more compact, and it uses considerably more brass than wood, which is a product of Harrison being based in London with access to many world-class clock and watchmakers that he could subcontract the actual craftsmanship to. It works on a similar principle to H1. You can probably see the counterbalances moving back and forth in the background there. But it included some improved features, a secondary winding mechanism smoothed out stress on the escapement, an even better bimetallic strip setup, and a few other features, any one of which would have led to a lucrative patent and a huge advance in precision clock and watchmaking by itself. By the start of the 1740s, this poor thing was being heated, frozen, and flung around by increasingly enthusiastic members of the Royal Society in a battery of tests that were surely far, far more violent than anything you could reasonably expect to be experienced aboard a ship. Not that the risk was entirely one-sided. Although smaller than H1, the device weighs about 43 kilos, more than H1, largely thanks to the greater proportion of metal in it. The Royal Society reckoned that this clock was worthy of the £20,000 prize, but there were two problems. Firstly, the Royal Navy was at that point involved in the War of Austrian Succession, which meant the Admiralty was unwilling to take it to sea for testing lest it fall into Spanish hands, so vital was it to the continued improvement of the Navy. And secondly, Harrison had discovered a fundamental flaw in those wonderful counterbalancing bar balances. They worked in almost every conceivable circumstance a ship might experience, bar one. If a ship took a sweeping turn, the complex swinging motion could still affect the clock's timekeeping. As such, Harrison was unhappy with it, and although he turned it over as promised, he asked the board for a further stipend to let him go back and try and make an even better clock. This was granted, and Harrison began work on his next clock, which became known as H3. That's over here. H3 left the bar balance behind in favour of what you can see oscillating back and forth at the top there and maybe around the side, circular balances. This clock also included even more innovations. There was now a bimetallic strip in as a tensioner for the balance spring as well. He also just happened to invent and include the caged roller bearing, which is a direct ancestor of the caged ball bearing, which would become so vital in almost every large mechanical product of the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries. H3 was ready for testing within 5 years, but Harrison kept making changes and improvements. The clock won the Copley Medal, the highest honour the Royal Society could bestow, in 1749, and became quite the tourist attraction. Benjamin Franklin rocked up in 1757 and paid the frankly absurd amount of 10 shillings and sixpence just to have a look at it, which is about £75 if you go by inflation only, or over £1,200 if you go by comparative value measurements. Occasionally emerging from the workshop to ask for, and be granted, a new stipend, Harrison worked away for over a decade, whilst outside, other advancements were being made.
During the 1730s, an English squire, John Hadley, and a Philadelphia glazier, Thomas Godfrey, had separately, but almost simultaneously, invented the same device. Called a quadrant, octant, reflecting quadrant, or similar, it was rapidly developed into the sextant. This allowed accurate observations of the position of the sun and moon, or moon and stars, to be made, which could then be compared to much improved almanacs to allow the calculation of longitude. But whilst the sextant and the tracks of the moon were ready by the end of the 1730s, turning all of this into a set of almanacs, which capitalised on the colossal amount of work and the new discoveries about the finer points of Earth's orbit and the Moon's orbit, their relative relationship to each other, as well as the confirmation that the Earth was definitely moving through space, all of which relied on work that had been done at the Greenwich Observatory in conjunction with other observatories and observatory stations around the world, would take quite some time. It wasn't until 1757 that the revised lunar method could be taken to sea for testing. And even then you needed to have a vast knowledge of mathematical equations to make all the needed corrections to your on-deck observations before then plugging the refined result into an almanac comparison, which would then allow you to work out where you were. And even at that stage, unless you wanted to wait for local noon to calibrate, you still needed a reliable clock to tell you the local time relative to the almanac observation time. Meanwhile, back in England, in the early 1750s, almost as a distraction, Harrison had commissioned John Jeffreys to make him a watch of his own design. This included a new type of escapement of Harrison's devising, as well as another of his ideas, a wheel train which meant it could run on a single spring, but that spring could also be wound without disrupting its drive to the rest of the device, something which is now pretty much a common feature on most mechanical watches. The whole thing was also helped due to the development of new crucible steel, which was better for some parts of the mechanism than brass.
In 1757, H3 was finally ready. It weighs a mere 30 kilograms, but it still didn't meet with Harrison's approval, although he thought it might actually pass the board trial. But there was another war going, the 7 Years' War, so sea trials would have to wait. Instead of wasting that time, Harrison now put all the work, almost 2 decades, that he'd invested into H3 into combination with some of the newer things that he'd had built into his little pocket watch. He then merged them with some of the new materials available, and in a stunning 2 years, he completely abandoned the past 3 decades of work that we've just seen and turned up in 1759 with a mere 1.5 kilo oversized pocket watch, a huge contrast to all these previous efforts. That was, and is, H4. Too small to use lignum vitae, he instead resorted to tiny diamonds and rubies in a search to eliminate friction without having to use oil, although in the end so small were the parts that a small measure of it was still needed. It included the winding mechanism found in the watch, but the spring itself was good for 30 hours, so a daily rewinding would always leave it with plenty of backup tension. But of the 4 Harrison timepieces here in the observatory, H4 is unique in that, as you can see, it doesn't run. Due to the need for small amounts of oil and that liquid's tendency to seep and decay, if it was kept running, as H1 through H3 are, it would need maintenance every 3 or 4 years, and with that comes wear and tear and the risk of damaging small parts or them becoming lost every time you have to take it apart. And so it remains inert while its wonderful predecessors tick on.
Unfortunately, by the end of the 1750s, the membership of the Board of Longitude had changed significantly. The new Astronomer Royal, James Bradley, was quite the opposite of Halley. Whilst both were quite interested in the lunar calculation method, Halley just wanted something that worked. Bradley was obsessed with claiming the prize for himself via the lunar method, and now did all he could to frustrate Harrison, who was now in his late 60s and was being supported in his efforts by his son William. By 1761, the war had calmed down enough that scientific voyages could be risked. The initial plan was for both H3 and H4 to go out on trial together. William Harrison therefore took H3 to Portsmouth and waited for both assignment to a ship and the arrival of H4, to which his father was making almost daily minor adjustments. Eventually, in November, HMS Deptford, a swift 60-gun fourth rate, was made available. William would sail in place of his father, but with H4 alone. George Harrison was confident enough in H4 to have removed H3 entirely from the tests. On the first leg, many casks of beer, as well as pretty much all of the cheese, were found to have been spoiled, and they had to be thrown overboard. Soon the ship's company was down to the questionable supply of fresh water. Captain Diggs was worried. Madeira was their closest port of call, and wine could be bought there to replace the lost beer, but by his reckoning, they still had some days to go before they reached the port. William Harrison consulted the H4 watch, worked out their longitude, and said that actually they were less than a day away. The next morning, sure enough, Madeira was sighted, and Diggs promised to buy the very first sea watch that the Harrisons made available for sale. The error between the dead reckoning and the watch was about 1.5 degrees, and the watch was bang on. After 3 months at sea, they reached Jamaica, where it was found that after 81 days at sea, H4 had only lost 5 seconds, massively within the margins of the £20,000 prize. In a somewhat humorous ceremony, Captain Diggs bought and then presented the younger Harrison with an octant, the means of measurement for the lunar method, which might seem a little bit odd until you realise he was basically handing the Harrisons the equivalent of their rival's head on a platter. Aboard the much smaller sloop HMS Merlin, William Harrison and H4 made a much rougher journey back home, setting foot ashore in England on March 26, 1762. The total error accumulated on both voyages combined was just under 2 minutes, which was still well inside the margin for the £10,000 prize after having travelled double the required distance without any checks. This performance alone should have won the Harrisons the top prize, but as mentioned, the board had changed. Instead of £20,000, they were awarded £1,500 with the promise of another £1,000 if H4 completed another trial, with the justifications given being, like some British government bodies these days, made up after the fact for the sole reason of denying the claim. In fact, as mentioned earlier, a good number of the current board members were actually heavily invested, both literally as well as figuratively, in the lunar method. Although the astronomer Bradley had died in 1762, his successor, Bliss, was just as invested and derided the success of H4 as luck, perhaps somewhat stung by a simultaneous voyage that had used his beloved lunar method in 1761, which had returned errors of 1.5 degrees, 50% outside the lowest catchment boundary, to win the prize. Despite the lunar method being significantly more complicated to work out, whilst the humble H4 had, with the work of a regular Royal Navy crew, spent most of its time accurate to within a few miles, as opposed to the lunar method's 90. A second trial, nonetheless, headed for Barbados in March 1764, once again with William and H4 aboard HMS Tartar, whilst the Princess Louisa had left in September 1763 carrying the lunar method and one of its strongest proponents, Neville Maskelyne, with the idea to test both that as well as a revival of the Jupiter-observing stabilised telescope sphere, which had mercifully moved away from the oil bath method. The latter still proved a failure. The movement of Jupiter was too fast to keep track of, even with the complex gizmo's assistance. The lunar tables, however, when consulted and measured by an expert in the mathematics involved, were proving to be accurate to within about 0.5 degree, which was much improved on the performance of the 1761 expedition. Both parties returned to the UK, with the finding being that the lunar method was now overall accurate to within a degree, which was enough to theoretically net the lower £10,000 prize, and in any case, £5,000 was awarded to the widow of the man who'd painstakingly put the lunar tables together in the first place, Tobias Mayer, since it was clearly a huge improvement over not finding longitude at all. Still, this was a 60-mile margin of error. The error of H4 at Barbados, however, had been just under 10 miles, significantly better. So, of course, the board changed the rules again. They were now arguing that since Harrison hadn't told everybody how the watch worked, well, and they would now only prepare to offer him £10,000, but on the condition that he handed over both H3 and H4, as well as the full plans for H4, effectively preventing him from making any more of them, and giving the board, incidentally, the ability to profit from any further devices manufactured, because they could send the plans to whoever they liked. If the Harrisons wanted the other £10,000, then they would also have to produce, at their own expense, 2 further copies of H4, without access to H4 or the plans for it. By 1765, arguments had raged back and forth, whilst Maskelyne, who had now succeeded to Astronomer Royal and head of the board, was trying at length to persuade anyone who would listen to him that the lunar method was better, despite the fact it needed 4 hours at the very best to compute a less accurate solution than H4 could manage in minutes. Eventually, Harrison gave in and took apart and reassembled H4 whilst explaining what each and every single piece did to an observing audience. His drawings were also surrendered, and then the board also contrived to seize all 4 timepieces, H1s through 4, for prolonged examination by Maskelyne, who not only balked at signing a receipt saying that he had taken them from Harrison's house in good working order, but whose workers then accidentally, I'm sure, proceeded to drop H1 on its way out. Mysteriously, despite having managed to keep time on 2 transatlantic sea voyages under the sole examination of Maskelyne, who incidentally, of course, was a man who hated the device almost as much as a man can hate a piece of clockwork, H4 mysteriously began to fail. Harrison was left to work on H5 and theoretically H6 with only his experience and memory. The board refused to let him have his plans or H4 back, as we mentioned, whilst Maskelyne had the plans for H4 transcribed into a book, which he then published, so that anyone in theory could copy the design for free. The fact that royalties from the book came back to him was of course entirely coincidental. Amusingly, since Harrison had written all of the notes that went with the plans, it turned out that nobody could understand a word of what he had written, and they were pretty much useless anyway. In the end, the elder Harrison managed to complete H5, which was a similar device to H4, whilst Larkham Kendall, the former apprentice of watchmaker John Jeffreys, was brought in by the board to produce an exact replica of H4, K1. William Harrison was actually quite happy with this, as Kendall was of course known to him, and K1, 2.5 years in the making, was sent out on an expedition with one Captain James Cook, along with 3 other chronometers produced by one John Arnold. Cook set out on his second voyage aboard HMS Resolution in 1772, and part of this voyage was to compare the lunar method, which Cook was educated enough to understand and compute, with the various devices that were now being dubbed marine chronometers. Cook would end up using K1 almost exclusively, producing maps on his voyage that were so accurate that mildly updated versions of some of them were still in use by British, Dutch, American and Australian officers at sea during World War II. Meanwhile, the older Harrison had actually managed to complete H5, but he realised that he was not going to be able, in his advanced age, to build H6. Nor was he likely to live long enough to see the board's next invented tests for H5. So instead, the same year that Cook set out, William Harrison wrote directly to the King, explaining the situation. George III took H5 into his personal care and directed that a series of tests, ostensibly to the letter the same as Maskelyne's tests of H4, be conducted under his personal supervision at Richmond. After a few days, where H5 went wild, until the King remembered that he happened to have stashed a bunch of magnetic lodestones in the cupboard next to it, of course H5 having significant steel components, the King then moved the lodestones. This settled the device down, and after 10 weeks of observations, H5 had varied only by 1/3 of a second per day. The King then promptly circumnavigated the board and went straight to the Prime Minister. The matter went to Parliament, and Harrison was awarded £8,750, almost the whole balance of what he was rightfully owed. Then, in 1775, Cook returned with effusive praise for K1, H4's clone, and precious little to say about the lunar charts, his logs instead replete with references to what he called the Watch, which he had become to regard as something of a personal friend. The next year, 1776, George Harrison died, vindicated at last in his closing years. Harrison's work lived on, though, as various watchmakers used his plans to try and simplify the admittedly expensive and rather long process that was involved in replicating H4 directly. Some of these early efforts were obviously less than successful, although Maskelyne became the mortal enemy of pretty much the entire London watchmaking scene, as they soon found out that the trials he insisted on putting their entries through personally became more and more rapidly little more than thinly veiled excuses to find creative ways to break them. Arnold, who'd provided the other 3 chronometers that went out with Cook in 1772, had devised a solution to the slow replication process. He farmed out the bulk of the production of his version to numerous craftsmen and then focused his expert efforts solely on crafting the hardest bits and then calibrating the resulting chronometers as they were put together. Production of reliable timepieces went from single figures per builder per lifetime to hundreds. Although the ones sent with Cook had performed poorly, that is Arnold's, by the time he'd made Arnold chronometer number 36, his errors were down to 3 seconds a day in variance. Not a patch on H4 or H5, but more than enough for general use. This was furthered by Thomas Earnshaw, who hit upon a reliable enough design and then started making them en masse about 1 every 2 months, whilst Arnold would make a run of about half a dozen to a dozen before incorporating some new idea he'd had into the next batch. A rather acrimonious competition between the two continues in debates amongst historians to this day, but it can at least be said that it drove both men to make more reliable chronometers even faster and available for even less.
By the 1780s, captains of both the Royal Navy and the East India Company were gladly buying the latest chronometers at £60 to £80 a time, buying them out of their own pocket, despite this being an inflation-adjusted equivalent of around £10,000, or a relative income value of £150,000. So valued were these chronometers. The Navy secured a stock and locked them away in Portsmouth for issue to ships that were about to head out. By the time HMS Beagle headed out on her famous voyage, there were no less than 22 chronometers aboard, half of them from the Admiralty and the other half from either the private ownership of Captain Fitzroy or on loan from some of his friends. The losses the Royal Navy suffered during the Napoleonic Wars to navigational error dropped massively, whilst the ability of the British ships to outsail their rivals was helped on still further by being able to plot their courses far more accurately than other navies, whose own clockmakers proved unable to mass-produce accurate timepieces for quite a while.
Whilst the almanac and its lunar observations continued to be published, and less well-off captains used them exclusively since a copy of the tables and a sextant to go with it could be had for a mere £20, on the frontline ships of the Royal Navy this was a secondary method to the precise ticking of between 1 and 3 chronometers.
However, the use of the lunar method as backup to the chronometer, or as the primary method on smaller ships or foreign ships that needed to navigate precisely but couldn't get their hands on a British-made chronometer in the first part of the 19th century, had an unintended side effect. A chronometer could calculate relative longitude from any meridian as long as the charts were available and drawn to that line. But the lunar tables were all produced from the Greenwich Observatory, making it the standard navigational reference. And as British Admiralty charts became the standard navigational charts across the world as the 19th century pressed on, these were also drawn to the Greenwich meridian, with the positions of various landmasses established by a legion of British ships wielding chronometers for longitude reference. And so, in 1884, when an international conference was held to decide on what should be the standard international meridian, there really wasn't any other choice. This meridian, the one in Greenwich, was chosen at that conference by every single nation that was there, except of course for the French, who would hold out till 1911. And to be honest, even after 1911, they continued to refer to the Greenwich meridian, the one they actually now had to measure from, as the Paris meridian minus a little bit. So currently, I'm standing in the Western Hemisphere, but I am now standing in the Eastern Hemisphere. And now I am thoroughly geographically confused. From the end of the 18th century, at 1 p.m. each day, the ball that you can see here on top of the Greenwich Observatory would be raised and then dropped. This allowed all the shipping on the Thames, which from masthead could see this particular area back in those days, to set their chronometers before venturing forth. And you can see why international shipping based in the ports of London would be able to see this drop. We're filming from about 20 feet to the right of that big red ball, and what you can see ahead of you now is what's now the O2 Arena, but that is on the Greenwich Peninsula. That used to be an area where there would be lots of shipping. And then as we pan across, you'll see coming into view what's now the National Maritime Museum, but used to be the hospital for retired sailors and injured sailors. So this is where the Royal Navy was based. This massive collection of skyscrapers directly ahead of us, well, that's based in the London Docklands. It's called the Docklands because that entire area, instead of being a bunch of buildings, used to be a whole network of canals and docks and warehouses for the loading and unloading of shipping. And then as we pan even further left, you can see the curve of the Thames. You can see the Cutty Sark and its masts there, which we might look at some point in the future. And then right over to our left, you can see the Dome of St. Paul's, which is actually beyond London Bridge, which is the highest point on the river that masted ships can navigate. So all along there, if you imagine all of these skyscrapers and large tower blocks aren't in the way, any ship that was moored in the Thames, from London Bridge, past Tower Bridge, the Tower of London, all the way around the Arc of the Thames, and coming down here, through the Docklands, through the warehouses, and pretty much all the way out past Greenwich and Deptford, could all see this location. So it was an absolutely perfect place from which people could check their chronometers and make sure they were ready before they headed out to sea.
But for some while after these remarkable changes, consigned to rot away in a storage vault by Maskelyne, H1 through H3 mouldered away, bar one brief cleaning effort in 1836, until Lieutenant Commander Gould of the Royal Navy volunteered to clean and restore them in 1920. H3 would prove especially challenging, as within he found the remains of a number of devices which Harrison had built into the clock, installed, but then bypassed for better ones, which were also still in place. Missing pieces of H1 also had to be replaced. However, this work was successful, which resulted in the magnificent display that you can come and see today at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. And so it was that the legacy of John Harrison contributed in a huge way not only to the success of the Royal Navy, but subsequently to that of the British Empire, and, perhaps more importantly on a global scale, to the safe navigation at sea generally. Tens, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of lives, or more, are owed to the dogged and determined efforts of a Yorkshire carpenter whose goal in life was simply to make his mark with the finest chronometers that the world had ever seen up until that point. And I think, in the end, he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.